So, summer's almost over. For some of you, you gotta find ways to survive that upcoming school year. And for people like me, we gotta fend off the existentialism of having graduated over a year ago and are still looking for employment. So let's do that. In the spirit of autumn, here is another list of books from my personal library that I feel are seasonally appropriate. Mr. Norrell is on a quest to bring back magic to 1800s England. Only he wants to be the only magician around, and he doesn't want to employ fairies. Oh, and he wants to befuddle the French with magic. Yeah, this world is in the middle of fighting Napoleon Bonaparte, just stay with me here. His polar opposite is the young Jonathan Strange, who, on a whim because some old guy in a bush shouted a prophecy at him, decides he also wants to become a magician. And he's really good at it, too. Where Mr. Norrell is afraid to touch most of the Old English magic with a muzzle-loading flintlock musket with bayonet attachment, Jonathan Strange has no problems diving headfirst into the darkest of taboos. Throughout the story, we see these two characters come together first as teacher and student, and then rivals, and finally bitter enemies as they try to shape the magical world into their own image. Yet another fairy tale-based story, though leaning more towards the brothers Grimm. Jacob Reckless has been using the mirror in his father's office to visit the mirror world for years, a world where glass slippers, golden trees, and goblins are commonplace. But everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Actually, it was a band of stone soldiers who clawed open Jacob's brother's throat. Now, Jacob and his trusty shape-shifting companion Fox must find a way to cure Will before he turns into one of the monsters who wounded him. Now, this story is dark, gritty, and dramatic. I'm talking blood, death, Jacob accidentally makes out with Will's girlfriend. If you watched the last video, I talked about the Inkheart trilogy. Well, this series, yeah, it's a series, where's book 5, Cornelia, was written by the same author. It turns a lot of the classic fairy tale tropes on their heads. Princes don't show up for their damsels in distress, said damsel in distress ends up at some point to go and our hero isn't a knight in shining armor, but a 24-year-old treasure hunter with some serious daddy issues. The story unfolds upon the backdrop of a medieval fairy tale entering the Industrial Age, akin to 1800s Europe. A lot of fairy creatures like dragons have been hunted to extinction, and the surface world is in the middle of a bloody war with the stone-skinned Goyle. It's a magical world whose magic is slowly dying, and what magic remains is doing its utmost best to leave its mark on everyone and everything. If you've been following the animation studio Laika, then you know that their upcoming film Wildwood is out in October. But did you also know that it's based off a book of the same name? I didn't, until I was browsing a bookstore last month and saw it in the kids section, and I thought I'd read it to prepare myself for the movie. And oh boy, this is yet another glorious example of books that are written for kids and end up not being very kid-friendly. I'm sure you've seen the trailer for the movie, so I won't go into too much detail about the story. The main character's baby brother is stolen by an evil witch, and she needs to go into the Wildwood to find him. Pretty straightforward. But everything that happens in between is maybe less so. There's talking animals, civil war, tree shamans. As a reader, you're just thrown into this world that's got its own plot and politics already happening, which can leave you feeling a little bit confused and lost, but I don't know, I think it makes you able to relate to the main characters more, which are going through this story going, what the heck is happening every 2 seconds? In fact, it's a similar feeling to starting a FromSoft game as a chosen undead, and you have no idea what happened after you were thrown in that well, just that you've got to slap every beast between Yharnam and Anor Londo to become Elden Lord. I just read this one recently, and I'm halfway through the sequel. By far, one of the most unique stories I have ever read. If you've ever dared to dip your toes into the boiling pool of oil that is the Arabian Nights, then you'll find a lot of similarities with this book. A prince stumbles across an orphan girl living in isolation in the garden of his father's palace. Totally smitten, he secretly visits her every night to hear the stories that are literally written on her eyelids. In true Arabian Nights fashion, each story contains further stories within that story. Think Inception. It might not be for everyone, but the author's writing style is really colorful and I find myself feeling super engaged. I'm a bit of an aphantasic when it comes to books, but Valente's poetic descriptions and Michael Kaluta's illustrations really paint a complete picture in my mind. Plus, the mythology of this invented world is pretty original. There are some stories where you can see the fairy tale influence/references, but for the most part, it's unique. Outside of the stories that the prince is told, there's also the subplot following the prince himself, who we slowly come to realize is just as much a prisoner as the orphan girl, albeit a rich one. Speaking of riches, I'm not sure how qualified I am to give a complete judgment of this series since I've only just started the first book, but The Lies of Locke Lamora is a fine book, and you should read it. First off, it's got an Italian-inspired setting, which is a plus in my book. Think Venice, but if Venice were built from the glass remains of an ancient forgotten kingdom. Second, the main character is a sassy little bitch who I would liken to Robin Hood if he led Ocean's 11. He's got a reputation as being a master thief and the greatest swordsman of all time, but that's all theatrics. Yeah, he's a master thief, but he also straight up gets his balls kicked into his lungs in the first 100 pages. And while his gentleman bastards do indeed steal from the rich, they sure as shit don't give to the poor. This story offers a fresh perspective on the noble thief trope. Said thief, the Thorn of Camor, is noble only in guise, but in reality he's more of the rogue bandit class variety with impeccable table manners. The schemes he lays are masterfully clever and ridiculously intricate, always 10 steps ahead of his victims. In a fantasy world full of violence and blade work, Locke Lamora's true power comes from his brains and his nat 20 charisma. I am super invested, and I think you will be too. To quote the script I'm reading right now, it's a breath of unconventionally fresh air in a market saturated with fantasy slop. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a bit of an aphantasic when it comes to books. I have a hard time imagining characters' faces and an even worse time imagining environments. So most of my reading experience is like this blurry-faced mannequin standing in black empty space. Sometimes, to fill the void, instead of imagining real people in a real world, I will assign an animation style to kind of better help me visualize, though a descriptive writer or pictures definitely goes a long way. So where am I going with this? I hear you, Dumbledore, calmly. Maybe it's all in my head, but Fyodor Dostoevsky's books are so freaking anime. A lot of the characters are really over the top, half of them are batshit crazy, and even when the plot isn't about murder, there is at least one gruesome killing in every single one of his books. Additionally, the way he describes mental health is so relatable that you feel especially connected to the characters. They also have inner dialogues with themselves a lot, which I feel is extra anime. Now, which of his books am I recommending to you specifically? Honestly, that's kinda up to you. My first book of his that I read was Crime and Punishment, but I have since read every single one of his novels, and they're all good in their own way. Granted, there's a lot of socio-political commentary that I don't fully understand, having never lived in 19th century Russia, but I mostly stay for the psychological mind games everyone's playing on each other. Some people are turned off by classics, I get that, but put this in perspective. I read Les Miserables and Leo's Toy Store by War and Peace, and I like Dostoevsky's shit so much better. If you decide to dive in, the translations by these fine people are by far the best in my opinion. Some of the other translations can have really awkward grammar, but Richard and Larissa's versions have very natural sounding dialogue. I'll top this list off with one last fantasy banger in all senses of the word, the King Killer Chronicles. We begin with your standard fantasy world in turmoil. War is on the horizon. The king is taxing the hell out of the peasants, and the main character is an unassuming tavern keep named Coat. But that's just a disguise. In reality, he is none other than the legend himself. Quoth the mighty, quoth the king killer, adventurer extraordinaire, swordslinger, and banjo enthusiast. Coat narrates his own story in 3 parts, one for each of 3 days, from his humble beginnings among the Edema Rue troops, to his arcane education at the famed university, to the, wait, what the? Where the hell's book 3? Patrick Rothfuss spins a tale about a hero who defies conventional legend. The story has its fair share of fantasy epicness, but what stands out to me is how the reality of events has been twisted by storytellers. What we're getting in these 3 books is the hero's truth, which sometimes isn't as glamorous as the stories make it seem. I mean, like, half the first book is recounting Quote's time at college, which at the time was like painfully relatable, but I don't know, maybe not the stuff of legend. Now, is Quoth a veritable savant at everything he does? Yes. But he's not so perfect that you feel disconnected from him. You're right there with him, cheering him on, or facepalming his dumbass mistakes, or crying because his story is so freaking sad. In a way, I'm reminded a bit of The Witcher when I read these books. It's more of a gritty, down in the mud and shit, go for the Gronknucks type of hero story, rather than it being all flowing hair and shiny sword. Like, imagine if the whole of the Fellowship died before leaving the Shire, and now Frodo has to set out for Mordor alone with his wits and grit and seven-stringed lute. It's sorta like that. And that wraps up my fall reading recommendations. I've had a lot of fun creating this sort of content. After checking YouTube and seeing that the first recommendation video got a whopping 50 views, I decided, heck, I'll do another one. Just don't expect any more after this, because I've run out of books in my library to talk about. But here's a list of games you should play. I'm not making a third video for the